Sometimes you can never really tell where evil lies, and very often it can be within the person you would least suspect. Nancy Hazel, though she would later be nicknamed Nannie, was born on November the 4th, 1905, in Blue Mountain, Alabama, which is now situated within the city of Anniston, to parents Louisa and James Hazel, alongside her brother and 3 sisters. Nannie and her mother had a strong hatred for their father and husband, as he was an abusive man. James forced the 4 children to work on the family farm and refused to let them attend school, which caused them to grow up somewhat illiterate and showing poor academic skills. Before she had even reached her teen years, Nannie was subjected to being molested by a string of local men, but it was when she turned 7 that she had an experience which changed her entire life forever. The family were on a train heading for southern Alabama to visit some relatives, when it suddenly jolted to a stop. Nannie hit her head on the metal bar on the seat in front of her with quite a lot of force, which led to years of severe headaches, blackouts, and depression. She would later blame all of her issues, violent actions, and mental instability on this one accident. As she grew into adolescence, Nannie enjoyed reading her mother's romance magazines, dreaming of her own romantic future, but her favourite was always the Lonely Hearts column, a column that would unfortunately become an obsession of hers that would soon become deadly. In her teen years, James forbade his daughters to ever wear any makeup or attractive clothing, as he believed they would welcome men in to molest them. They were forbidden from ever going to any dances or social events. But surprisingly, when she turned 16, Nannie was granted permission by her father to marry 18-year-old linen factory worker Charlie Braggs after having only dated for around 4 months. Later speaking of the relationship, Nannie stated, quote, "I married as my father wished in 1921 to a boy I only knowed about 4 or 5 months who had no family. Only a mother who was unwed and who had taken over my life completely when we were married. She never seen anything wrong with what she'd done, but she would take spells. She would not let my own mother stay all night." End quote.
How old were you when you first got married?
16.
And how many times were you married?
5.
Why are you in the penitentiary now?
All the claim back to my husband.
Which, your last husband?
Yes, sir.
Did they say you killed any more?
Yes,
Or your other husband? Which other?
3 of them.
Did you?
Nothing.
Charlie's mother was a controlling woman who demanded that they remain living with her even after the wedding, taking up the majority of her son's attention and limiting Nannie's involvement in his life. In 1922, the couple had their first child, Gertrude, followed by Zelma the following year, Florine the year after that, and finally Malvina in 1926. However, the stress of early motherhood got to Nannie, and she began heavily drinking and smoking, and both she and her husband started to have sexual affairs, with Charlie often vanishing for days at a time. It was on August the 30th, 1927, when Charlie returned home from work, and his 4-year-old daughter Zelma was dead. Nannie claimed that she had succumbed to some unfortunate food poisoning, but on September the 25th, just a month later, the exact same thing happened again to 5-year-old Gertrude. Charlie was struggling to believe his wife's story, as both children were perfectly healthy in the morning, crying over him leaving for work, but then were dead upon his return. It was this incident that led to Charlie taking their youngest daughter Malvina and walking out on his wife, though he left 3-year-old Florine still in her care. Not long after, Charlie's mother passed away, so Nannie took a job in a cotton mill to try to support herself and her child. But by the summer of 1928, Charlie and Malvina returned. He now had a new girlfriend with him, who had a child of her own, and him and his ex-wife soon divorced. But Nannie ended up with the custody of both of their children, and returned to her mother with them. Charlie would later claim that he actually left her because he was terrified of the woman. It was in 1929 when Nannie met 23-year-old Robert Franklin Harrelson, to whom she quickly married and moved in with, bringing along her 2 children. It was just a few months into the relationship when she discovered that he was an avid alcoholic with a previous criminal record for assault, but this didn't deter her, and the couple would remain together for nearly 2 decades. However, allegedly she actually left 5-year-old Florine in their abandoned house before hitting the road. Supposedly, the neighbours had to track down Charlie Braggs to come back to retrieve his child. The next few years of Nancy Harrelson's life seem a mystery, and her exact whereabouts and actions are relatively unknown. It was in 1943 when Nannie became a grandmother, with Melvina and her husband Mosey Haynes welcoming the birth of their son Robert Lee, and 2 years later they had their own daughter, but this child would mysteriously pass away just days later. At the time, Melvina was exhausted from the labour and groggy from the ether administered to her, but she was convinced that she had witnessed her mother Nannie sticking a hat pin into the baby's head. Once asking her husband and sister for clarification, they claimed that it was Nannie who informed them of the baby's death, and confirmed that she was in fact holding a pin at the time. The doctors themselves could find no explanation whatsoever for the bizarre death. Not long after, Melvina and her husband began to drift apart, and she started to date a soldier, which Nannie greatly disapproved of. During an argument, Melvina decided to go and visit her father, leaving her son Robert in Nannie's care, which was a huge mistake. On July the 7th, 1945, Nannie's grandson Robert Lee Haynes mysteriously died at the age of just 2. The official report claimed that it was death by asphyxia from unknown causes. Just 2 months later, Nannie collected on the $500 life insurance, purchasing a plot of land and her own house in Jacksonville, Florida. Things would only escalate on September the 14th that year, when Nannie's own husband returned home, drunk, celebrating the end of World War II, before raping his wife. The following day, Nannie put some rat poison in his corn whiskey jar, and he died that very same evening, ending their marriage after 16 years.
I kind of poisoned them.
But you say you didn't poison them?
I didn't.
It didn't take long for Nannie to find another husband, however, meeting Arlie Lanning through the Lonely Hearts column whilst travelling in Lexington, North Carolina, and the two tied the knot just 3 days after meeting. At some point during this time, Nannie also visited her bedridden sister Dovie Weaver, but on June the 30th, 1950, just days after she had arrived, her sister also mysteriously passed away. Just a few months later, on September the 7th, Nannie continued the rampage by poisoning her husband's mother, giving off the illusion that she had simply died in her sleep. This was a time when an autopsy wasn't always administered unless the death seemed suspicious, so Nannie was often able to get away with it relatively easily. Much like her previous husband, Arlie was an alcoholic and a womanizer, but this time it was Nannie who often disappeared for months on end. However, once home she was a doting housewife who was well liked by the locals. On February the 16th, 1952, Arlie Lanning also mysteriously passed away from supposed heart failure, but because of his drinking problems, authorities blamed it on his alcohol abuse, and no further investigation was done.
You still maintain that you did not poison either your last husband or any of the
I
others?
certainly do.
Around this time, the couple's house, which was actually left to her husband's sister, strangely burned down, and the insurance money all went to Nannie, who instantly banked it. She soon joined a dating service known as the Diamond Circle Club, where she met Richard L. Morton, to whom she married in 1952 in Emporia, Kansas. Though, unlike her previous husbands, Morton wasn't an alcoholic, though he was unfaithful. At some point, Nannie's father James passed away. Not long after, in 1953, her mother fell and broke a hip and needed a carer, which fell to Nannie herself. However, in January, under Nannie's care, she too mysteriously passed away. The list would only continue on May the 19th that same year when Richard Morton also suddenly died.
If you could say something to people on the outside, say a mother who has a teenage daughter, what would you tell her about raising that daughter?
I tell her to go to church and keep her close by.
You think love is important today?
Yeah.
Just a month later, Nannie would marry yet again to devout Christian Nazarene minister Samuel Doss. However, this was a very different kind of relationship for her. Although he disapproved of her love for romance novels and stories, he wasn't abusive, nor was he an alcoholic, which, unbeknownst to Nannie at the time, would be her giant mistake. In September 1954, Nannie laced a prune cake with poison from Samuel Doss, and he was admitted to hospital, but survived. During his entire month-long recovery, his doctor had grown incredibly suspicious of Nannie, but had no evidence to back up his fears. On October the 5th, he was released with a diagnosis of a severe digestive tract infection, but just 1 week later, on October the 12th, she poisoned his coffee and finished off the job, later collecting 2 life insurance policies for the crime. This immediately alerted the doctor, who demanded an urgent autopsy to confirm his suspicions, in which a huge amount of arsenic was found inside his system. It was now when Nannie Doss was finally arrested.
At the time you were convicted, was there a lot of talk in the newspapers about that conviction?
Yes, sir.
What did they say about it?
Oh, they just said all kinds of nasty things.
You think they were right?
No, sir.
Several of the previous victims' remains were exhumed and examined to find arsenic or rat poison in their systems, and on May the 17th, 1955, she pled guilty and was sentenced to life, being spared the death penalty due to her gender.
How long would you be in prison?
Well, I spent it for life.
Would you ever get out?
I hope.
What would you do if you get out?
I would take my daughter's children and put them all four together and try to raise them.
What sort of a living would you try to make? What would you do?
Well, I don't know anything except in housekeeping and farm work.
But strangely, despite providing a full confession of murdering 4 husbands, her own mother, sister, grandson and mother-in-law, she was only ever charged for killing her husband, Samuel. During the entire trial, she blamed her behaviour on her brain injury caused as a child on the train, but supposedly, whenever asked about the murders, she would often laugh when retelling the story, causing her to be nicknamed the Giggling Granny.
The reason you were convicted, who do you blame for that?
Myself.
Why?
Well, I didn't know anything about it, and never the attorney told me to go down and plead guilty. I just did.
Do you think it's valuable for people to have some knowledge of the law
I certainly do.
in cases like this?
I certainly do.
She denied the murders being financially motivated, and claimed to have simply been trying to find the perfect man. Quote, "I was searching for the perfect mate, the real romance in life." End quote. It was concluded that she would simply have enough of a husband and then decide to kill him and move on, selecting those with alcoholism or heart conditions so that their abrupt deaths wouldn't cause much speculation. On June the 2nd, 1965, Nannie Doss passed away from leukemia in the hospital ward of the Oklahoma State Penitentiary at the age of 59, and was buried at the Oak Hill Memorial Park in McAlester, Oklahoma, leaving her true motive and long rampage behind, with her descendants still seeking answers.